Snow fell heavily that December night, blanketing the grand mansion in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a silent white sheet. The wind howled through the window cracks, but inside the basement, only a small heater fought against the bone-chilling cold. Paul Harrington sat at a worn wooden table, adjusting the collar of his impeccably ironed white shirt. Being a butler for Howard Whitmore, a reclusive and eccentric billionaire, required perfection in every detail, even on Christmas Eve. "Dad, do you think he'll want to have dinner with you tonight?" Ben asked from across the basement. The 10-year-old boy was in his wheelchair, pushing small toy cars over a makeshift ramp made of old books. Paul sighed, adjusting his jacket on the chair. "No, son. Mr. Whitmore prefers to be alone, but who knows? Christmas can be full of surprises." Ben smiled. He always saw the bright side, even while living in a cold, cramped basement. His optimism had kept Paul going ever since his wife, Laura, had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The pain was still there, like a wound that never fully healed, but Ben was his reason to keep moving forward. Paul climbed the stairs to the mansion's main kitchen, where he would prepare Christmas dinner. The house was quiet, as always. Howard Whitmore lived in isolation, rarely receiving visitors and avoiding contact with the outside world. He was a man of few words, but his gaze carried a weight Paul could never decipher, something between guilt and longing. While chopping vegetables, Paul thought back to the first time he entered the mansion 5 years ago. What was supposed to be a temporary job had turned into a refuge. Whitmore had offered the basement to him and Ben upon learning of their situation, but the generosity stopped there. The employer rarely interacted with them, preferring to stay in his upstairs office filled with antique books and paintings of melancholic landscapes. "Dad, look at this!" Ben's excited voice echoed down the hallway. Paul hurried downstairs, worried, but found his son pointing at a small wooden box he discovered under the bed. "Where did you find that?" Paul asked, intrigued. "It was there, kind of hidden. Looks important," Ben replied. Paul carefully opened the box. Inside was a collection of old photos, documents, and a gold ring with an inscription he couldn't decipher. But one of the photos caught his attention. Howard Whitmore, younger, standing next to a woman and a child who looked about Ben's age. "Who are they?" Ben asked, curious. Paul didn't answer. There was something strange, something he'd never known about Whitmore's past. He put the box away and promised himself he'd ask his employer, even if it meant crossing a line. That night, while serving dinner at the long, empty dining table, Paul finally mustered the courage. "Mr. Whitmore, may I ask something personal?" he said, placing the plate in front of him. Howard looked up, surprised. "You can try, Paul, but I can't promise I'll answer." Paul pulled the photo from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Who are these people?" "I found this in the basement." Howard stared at the photo for a long moment. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Paul saw a look of vulnerability on his face. "That is a story I'd rather forget, but perhaps it's time you knew, since you and your son live here." Paul's heart raced. Something told him his life was about to change. "Sit down, Paul. You need to hear this." Howard Whitmore took the photograph with trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the faces frozen in time. Paul, now seated across from him, felt as though he'd crossed an invisible line, the one separating employer and employee. But something in Howard's expression suggested that this barrier was about to disappear. "This woman is my wife, Eleanor, and the boy," Howard paused, as if the next words were too painful to say, "was my son, Michael." Paul didn't know how to respond. He had never imagined that Howard had a family. The man had always been a mystery, a distant and introspective presence. Now, this small fragment of information changed everything. "They aren't here anymore?" Paul asked cautiously. Howard shook his head slowly. "No, Eleanor passed away over 20 years ago. Cancer." "Michael," he hesitated again, looking away. "Michael disappeared shortly after. I never found him. I never knew what happened to him." The silence in the room was heavy, like lead. Paul felt a mix of empathy and curiosity. He knew his employer wasn't a man who shared emotions easily. The mere act of revealing this seemed monumental. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore. I can't imagine what it must have been like to go through that." Howard nodded silently, his gratitude unspoken. He placed the photo back on the table and fixed his gaze on Paul. "But why did you find this now? No one has touched that basement in years." Paul hesitated but decided to be honest. "My son, Ben, found the box while playing. He's curious like any child, but we didn't want to invade your privacy." Howard was thoughtful for a moment. "Finally," he said, "I want to show you both something." "Tomorrow?" "At midnight." Paul frowned, puzzled. "Midnight? Why?" Howard just smiled, an enigmatic smile that offered no answers. Then he stood up, taking the photo with him. "You'll understand. Trust me." That night, back in the basement, Paul told Ben about what had happened. "He wants to show us something. Tomorrow, very late. Are you curious?" Ben nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. Who knows what he's hiding in that huge house?" Paul smiled but still felt a slight discomfort. Howard was a man full of secrets, and this promise left more questions than answers. The next day, the routine seemed the same as always. Paul tended to his daily chores while Ben explored every safe corner of the basement. But anticipation hung in the air. When the clock struck 11:50, Paul took Ben to the living room where Howard was already waiting, dressed in a heavy coat and scarf. He held a flashlight. "Are you ready?" Howard asked, without ceremony. Paul nodded, helping Ben adjust his coat. "Where are we going?" Howard didn't answer. Instead, he led them out of the house, crossing the vast, snow-covered garden. The cold cut like blades, and the mansion's lights soon faded behind them. They stopped in front of a small cabin at the edge of the property, one Paul hadn't even known existed. Howard unlocked the door and turned on the flashlight, revealing an interior filled with boxes, files, and an old wooden table. He picked up one particular box and placed it on the table. "This is why I live the way I do. The reason I gave up everything." Paul and Ben exchanged a confused look. Howard opened the box, revealing a collection of journals, newspaper clippings, and more photographs. One name appeared repeatedly on the papers: Michael Whitmore. "I've spent the last 20 years trying to find him," Howard explained. "I hired investigators, followed leads, but I never got any definitive answers. This is my personal archive. You're the first people to see it." Ben picked up one of the clippings and read it aloud. "12-year-old boy disappears from local school." Paul felt a chill. "He just vanished?" Howard nodded, his voice heavy. "It was the most horrible day of my life. After Eleanor died, Michael was all I had. Then, on an ordinary day, he didn't come home, and that was it. There was no ransom, no letter, nothing. Just emptiness." Ben seemed both fascinated and saddened. "But why do you think he might still be alive?" Howard hesitated. "Because I never found a body. And because, somewhere in here," he pointed to the journals, "something tells me I missed an important clue." Paul looked at the documents, feeling an unexpected sense of responsibility. He knew this wasn't something a butler should get involved in, but he also knew Howard needed help. More than that, he felt Ben could learn something valuable from this story about resilience, empathy, and even the strength of a father who never gives up. Howard Whitmore sat in a worn leather armchair, surrounded by the memories of his relentless search for answers. Paul and Ben were by his side, their expressions oscillating between curiosity and an almost reverent respect for the pain Howard carried. "You're the first people in years to know about this." "I hid everything because I never had the courage to face the truth. But maybe now it's time to change that." He opened one of the journals. The yellowed pages were filled with notes in firm but hurried handwriting. Paul leaned in to read, but Howard began explaining before he could decipher anything. "When Michael disappeared, I did everything to find him. I hired the best detectives, used every resource I had. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized it wasn't a simple case of disappearance." Paul raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" Howard sighed, running a hand over his face as if trying to erase painful memories. "Michael had a very close friend, a boy named David. They were always together. On the day Michael disappeared, David vanished too. But David's family received a note, a ransom demand. They never told me because they were afraid. They thought that I, with all my money, should already be taking care of it. When I finally found out, it was too late. Time had erased the clues and taken hope along with it. Ben, who had been silent until then, timidly raised his hand as if he were in school. And what happened to the other boy? Did you manage to find out? Howard shook his head. No. All I know is that his family moved away shortly after. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of fear. I never heard from them again. Paul felt a chill. The story was growing darker by the minute. But there was something in Howard's expression, a mix of regret and determination, that made him realize the man hadn't completely given up yet. And now, why did you decide to tell us this? Paul asked. Howard closed the journal with a soft snap and looked directly at Paul. Because I found something. Something that could change everything. He pulled an envelope from inside the box. It was worn, marked with smudged fingerprints and torn edges. When he opened it, it revealed a map and a smaller piece of paper with coordinates scribbled on it. This arrived anonymously at my door last week. I don't know who sent it, but it is the first concrete lead I've had in 20 years. Paul took the map, studying it closely. The coordinates pointed to a remote area in Maine, surrounded by dense forests and mountains. It was an isolated place, the kind of location where secrets could remain hidden for decades. Do you think Michael is there? Paul asked. Howard hesitated, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. I don't know, but I need to find out, and I need both of you with me. Paul leaned back slightly, surprised. Why us? Howard looked at Ben, then at Paul. Because you remind me of what matters most, family. And because, honestly, I can't do this alone. The trip to Maine was quickly planned. Howard arranged for a spacious car adapted to Ben's needs, ensuring he would be comfortable during the long journey. As they drove through snow-covered roads, Ben asked endless questions about what they might find. Paul, on the other hand, was more concerned about the dangers they might face. After all, it wasn't every day that you followed a mysterious map sent by an anonymous sender. When they finally arrived at the coordinates, they found a simple, abandoned cabin. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Howard led the way, with Paul right behind and Ben observing everything carefully from his wheelchair. Inside, the air was musty and heavy. Papers were scattered on the floor, and there were shoe marks and the dust signs that someone had been there recently. Howard opened a drawer in an old desk and found a notebook filled with notes. It is his, Howard said, holding the notebook like it was a treasure. It is Michael's handwriting. Paul stepped closer to look. The notes were messy but mentioned a nearby location, an underground shelter Howard had never known about. You two stay here, Howard said. I'll explore. It won't take long, but Paul wasn't willing to let him go alone. Wait, we don't know what we might find. Let us go together. Ben raised his hand. What about me? Howard smiled faintly. You stay here, Commander. If anything happens, we need you to be safe. Ben huffed but agreed, knowing it was pointless to argue. The shelter was hidden under a thin layer of snow and dry leaves. A rusty metal door led to a narrow, dark corridor. With each step, the silence was broken only by the sound of their boots against the concrete floor. Finally, they arrived at a large room lit by a single flickering fluorescent lamp. In the center of the room, there was a table with an old computer and piles of documents. Next to the table stood a man. He looked to be in his early 30s, with disheveled hair and sunken eyes. When he saw Howard, he froze. Are you my father? The man asked, his voice hoarse and incredulous. Howard fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he struggled to find words. Michael, the man nodded, tears streaming down his face. The underground room fell into complete silence. Paul, standing at the entrance, wasn't sure whether to step closer or give space to the profoundly personal moment unfolding before him. Howard, kneeling on the floor, stared at the man who had long been only a distant memory and a fragile hope. Michael looked confused and shaken, but there was a spark of recognition in his eyes, as if part of his heart had always known this encounter was possible. "Michael, is it you, my son?" Howard's voice cracked, trembling with a mix of emotion and uncertainty. Michael hesitated, his eyes darting between Howard and Paul. Finally, he nodded. "It's me, but why did it take so long?" The question, simple yet laden with pain, hit Howard like a blow. He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he managed. "I looked for you. All these years. I never gave up." Michael lowered his eyes, as if trying to absorb those words. Paul, sensing the moment needed an intervention, stepped forward. "Michael, my name is Paul. This is Howard, your father." Paul paused, carefully choosing his words. "He made mistakes, but he never gave up on finding you. We're here now, and I think that's what matters." Michael lifted his gaze to Paul, as though assessing his sincerity. After a long moment, he took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, but you need to know everything before we decide what happens next." Michael's account. They sat around the table on rickety chairs that creaked with every movement. Michael began to tell his story, his voice growing stronger as he unearthed memories long buried. "When I disappeared, it wasn't by choice. David and I were taken. It happened so fast. We were playing on the street when a car pulled up next to us. Two men got out and grabbed us. I didn't know what was happening." Paul and Howard exchanged horrified looks. "They took us to a place like this," Michael continued, gesturing to the room around them. "It was cold, dark. We didn't understand why we were there, but it soon became clear. They wanted money, a ransom." Howard closed his eyes, his hand gripping the edge of the table tightly. "And then, what happened to David?" Paul asked. Michael swallowed hard, looking away. David didn't make it. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Paul felt a pang in his chest, imagining the worst. "And you? How did you get out?" Howard asked, his voice barely audible. Michael looked at his father, his eyes burning with both anger and sadness. "I escaped. After months, I found an opportunity and ran, but I had nowhere to go. I didn't know how to find you, and when I finally tried, it was too late. I was already far away, living in shelters and doing what I could to survive." Howard put his head in his hands, fighting back tears. "I failed you. As a father, as a man. I didn't protect you." Michael stared at Howard for a long moment. Then his expression softened. "It's not just about you, Dad, but we're here now, and maybe it's time to leave the past behind." A new purpose. The night passed with more questions and shared stories. Michael showed documents and notes he had gathered over the years. They painted a grim picture of criminal networks exploiting children to extort wealthy families. Paul was shocked by how deep the problem ran. "This cannot go on," Paul said, his voice firm. "We have to do something." Howard, who looked worn but determined, nodded. "I have resources, people who can help, but I'll need both of you with me." "Michael, I don't want to pressure you, but would you be willing to help me take this down?" Michael hesitated but then looked at Paul and Ben. The boy, though absent, seemed to represent new hope, a chance for redemption. "I'll help, but on one condition." Howard leaned forward. "Anything." Michael took a deep breath. "We do this together, and you need to be a real father from now on. No running, no excuses." Howard nodded, his eyes glistening. "You have my word." Returning home at dawn, the improvised family was ready to leave the shelter. They didn't have all the answers, but they had something more valuable: each other. And as they returned to the mansion in Cambridge, there was a palpable sense of renewal in the air. Back at the mansion in Cambridge, the atmosphere was different. The weight of years of secrets and guilt seemed to have been replaced by a cautious sense of hope. For Paul and Ben, the return was not just a homecoming but the start of a new chapter in their lives. And for Howard and Michael, it was the first time in a long while that father and son were together under the same roof. In the days that followed, Howard kept his promise. With his vast resources, He hired a team of investigators and lawyers to delve deeper into Michael's discoveries about the criminal networks that had destroyed so many lives. Paul, now not just a butler but a confidant and ally, became a central figure in the planning. Ben, though young, was not left out. With his usual curiosity and technological skills, he helped organize information and connect important dots. Whenever Howard or Michael doubted the mission's success, it was Ben who motivated them with his optimistic words, "We can do this, because we're not alone." An unexpected alliance. As the investigation progressed, Howard realized they would need more than just money to bring down the criminal network. That's when he decided to contact an old friend, Rachel Carter, an investigative journalist known for exposing corporate scandals and organized crime. Rachel arrived at the mansion on a cold January afternoon. She was a determined woman with an air of authority that even intimidated Howard. After hearing everything, she leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with determination. "This is big, but if we're going to expose these people, we need solid proof. And we also need to be prepared for the consequences." Paul watched as the team gathered around the dining room table, now transformed into an improvised headquarters. He knew he was risking everything, but he also knew there was no turning back. The hard choice amid the planning, a discovery threatened to destabilize everything. One of the leads Michael had investigated revealed that some of the culprits had ties to influential people in Cambridge, including former associates of Howard. Howard fell silent as Rachel read the names aloud. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world had doubled. "If we expose this, it will destroy me too," he said, his voice rough. Michael crossed his arms, his gaze fixed firmly on his father. "Does that matter? You said you wanted to do the right thing." Paul felt the tension rise. He knew this decision was crucial for their future. Finally, he intervened. "Howard, you've spent your life trying to make up for a past mistake. Don't let the fear of losing your reputation stop you from doing the right thing now." Howard looked at Paul and then at Michael. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. It doesn't matter what happens to me. This has to end." The revelation, with the evidence gathered and Rachel's help, Howard called a press conference. He not only exposed the criminal networks but also admitted his own indirect involvement, publicly apologizing for the times his negligence contributed to the problems. The repercussions were immediate. Headlines across the country highlighted Howard's courage in facing his own mistakes and working to dismantle the scheme. Rachel published a series of in-depth reports, which led to several arrests and government investigations. But the exposure came at a cost. Howard lost important alliances and faced fierce criticism from some sectors of society. However, for him, none of that mattered. For the first time in years, he felt he was on the right path. The new chapter months later, the mansion was different. Not only in terms of atmosphere but also physically. Howard decided to turn the house into a community center, offering support to families affected by criminal networks and at-risk children. Michael became one of the leaders of the project, using his experience to help others overcome similar traumas. Paul continued to be a pillar of the new dynamic, now not just as a butler, but as a close friend and advisor. Ben, in turn, thrived amid all of this. He led technology workshops at the community center, teaching children how to use computers and dream of a better future. On the Christmas Eve that followed, everyone gathered for a party at the center. The room was filled with laughter, music, and a warmth that contrasted with the cold outside. Howard raised a glass of cider and looked at the friends and family around him. "Last year, I was lost. Today, I'm here, surrounded by the most important people in my life. This is a miracle, and I'm grateful to each of you." Michael smiled, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. "Sometimes miracles happen when we decide to act, and that's exactly what we did." Paul and Ben exchanged a knowing glance, aware that they had found something more valuable than any treasure, a family. As the snow gently fell outside, the sound of laughter and joy filled the space. It was a new beginning, a true rebirth, and proof that, even in the darkest of circumstances, light always finds a way to shine.